สวัสดีค่ะ Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be the moderator of second of this conference. My name is Min Rapirat, and on behalf of Safe Children Samuel UNESCO Bangkok, UNICEF Equitable, and UNICEF Thailand, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to the International Conference on Equitable Education Together Toward Equity. This conference will take place between 19 to 20 October 2022 at this wonderful place, Central Gan and Bangkok Convention Center at Central World Bangkok. Ladies and gentlemen, there are plenty of interesting topics waiting for you today. First, we will begin with the first session, which will be held in the breakout room format with the topic Recovery Program for Disadvantaged Group, Bridging the Gaps in Education. So I am pleased to have our Dr. Benjamin Ogan, Director MIT Abdul Latif Jameen, Poverty Action Lab, JPAL. So please welcome.
Great. Thank you very much. So my name is Ben Olken. I'm a professor of economics at MIT, and I head the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT. I'm one of the co-directors. And what I wanted to talk about today is the topic of social protection, and in particular, the question, which I think is going to be relevant to a lot of the themes that you're going to be discussing today, about how do you figure out, if you're trying to design programs that are particularly targeted towards those most in need, towards the poor, the vulnerable, how do you actually figure out who those people are? Okay, so that's the question I want to think about today. And as all of you know, I think the COVID crisis has brought a dramatic expansion in the number of programs worldwide that are aiming to help people, whether it's children or other vulnerable households. Basically, every country in the world has sort of scaled up its programs in one way or another, targeted at these poor, vulnerable, or needy households. But there's a question of how do you figure out who actually is poor? So if you're a government trying to design a government program or an NGO program or any program really aimed at poor households, you face a fundamental problem. The problem is, if you're giving out some kind of assistance, people are going to want to receive that assistance. So you need to differentiate between those who are most in need and those who are potentially a little bit less in need. So in high-income countries like the United States or other high-income countries, governments often can do that by using the tax records. They observe how much families earn, and they can use your official earned income as declared to the tax authority to do that. But in most low and middle income countries, that's not going to work because only the sort of very rich pay taxes in most low and middle income countries, right? So, to distinguish between someone who's at the 10th percentile and someone who's at the 50th percentile or the 70th percentile, none of them are paying taxes. So you can't really use government tax. Government doesn't observe anyone's income. So you need to find other strategies for trying to differentiate between those who are most in need and those who are potentially a little bit better able to sort of handle things themselves. So that's what I want to think about today. So in particular, I want to give an example from my own work in Indonesia, working with the Indonesian government to try to understand different approaches to solving this problem. So Indonesia has a lot of these targeted programs. I'm actually going to give an example from food, but the same examples I think could apply to education-related targeting or other types of programs. And this was an issue. It's been an issue for many years. It was certainly an issue in the COVID crisis. And so the question is, how do they solve this problem? And broadly speaking, I think countries around the world have, I would say, three basic options for how do you differentiate between sort of people who are most in need and people who are a little bit less in need. So one option is what's called a proxy means test. A proxy means test basically says, look, the government can't observe, or the NGO or whoever can't observe your income. And if they ask you, what your income is, people might lie. They might say, oh, well, of course, yes, I'm very poor, I'm very deserving. But what people can do is you can go to people's houses, you can observe some of the conditions at their house. You can say, what kind of roof do they have? What kind of walls do they have? What kind of appliances do they have? And so on and so forth. And you can predict, using a statistical model, what their likely income is as a function of the assets that you can observe. So a means test would be based on actual income, but we don't observe the actual income, so we use these proxies for income. That's why it's called a proxy means test. So that's one option. Now the problem, that's objective and consistent. The problem is that it's the income prediction is not perfect, and the statistical model isn't perfect. And also, if people experience shocks, right? Like, I was employed, I used to have a job, I have a nice house because I used to have a job, but I've lost all my income, I still have the house, so it's not a perfect predictor, right? And also, different communities may have different local perceptions of what poverty means. So it may be that, that in some area, or different patterns of consumption. So for example, it may be that in some areas, people really prioritize having a big fancy house, but don't prioritize, say, having a car or having a motorbike. But in other areas, actually, the signal of kind of that you're actually better off is that you have a motorbike. And so you want to take those local differences into account. So it's not perfect. A second approach is what we call community-based targeting. And here the idea is to say that in the community, like in a village or in an urban neighborhood, people know who's poor and who's most in need. And if you go around and ask people and you say, well, who's really the most vulnerable households in this village? And I've certainly done this in my own field, where people say, okay, it's this person over here. They're really having a tough time. They lost their job. Maybe the person's a widow or whatever circumstances. It's this person over here. But the question is, if you were to, can you actually, first of all, do they actually know? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. And if you try to actually design a whole program based on that community information, do you get the right answer? Do you get the right people you need? Or do you get kind of who maybe the local village elites want to kind of give the program to or whatever? Does it actually work? So it's pros and cons. All these have pros and cons. There's no perfect answer. And the third option, I would say, is what's called self-targeting or on-demand application or things like that. And the approach here is to say that poor households may have to apply to receive a program, or may have to take some action to receive a program. So, for example, many of you may have heard of the NREGA program in India. This is a program that provides work to rural households, but anyone who's in a rural household can work, but you have to actually go and work in order to receive the payments. So it's self-targeted because anyone who has a better opportunity for income is not going to go work on a government construction site at minimum wage. So that's those are approaches to try to get the poor to sort of self-select. So what I want to tell you about is an example of a study that we did in Indonesia where we compared two approaches, the proxy means test, the data approach, and the community-based approach. And this also, as well as a hybrid method, and this, I think, illustrates not only, I think, some substantive lessons about how do you identify the poor households, but also a methodology for trying to understand. So we actually ran a randomized trial working with the World Bank and the Indonesian government. And what we did is we worked in 640 villages and urban villages across Indonesia in multiple provinces. And we randomized them, so by lottery, into different targeting methods for a small transfer that was going to be given out. So in 200 and something villages chosen by lottery out of these 600, the government or we helped the government do a proxy means test. They collected the data on 44 households. In another 200 villages, they did the community targeting method, where they actually had a community meeting, and actually they brainstormed kind of what is local poverty in our area. They had a sign of what local poverty meant. And then they actually went through every single person's name in that neighborhood and said, okay, I'm going to first compare, Ben and Esther, and I say who's better off on our criteria. And we say, okay, Ben's better off. So we hung a little sign, said Ben over here and Esther over here. Then we picked the next person, and so where do they fit? And they had a complete ranking of sort of everyone in their neighborhood. And then they gave the transfer to the lowest ranked people. And the third option was a hybrid, where they basically did the community targeting first to get a list of possible names and then use the proxy means test there. So what did we find? Whoops. What we found is that if you assess the data based on actual poverty levels measured by data, per people's consumption level, who actually has the least amount of food to eat or whatever, the data-based approach actually did a little bit better. Okay, so this is the error rate. So the error rate is either you misclassify, you say someone who's actually poor, you don't classify them as poor, or someone who's actually not poor, you classify them as poor. The error rate was about 10% lower in the data-based method. Okay, so that's fine. So the error rate was 10% lower. So that says the database method works a little bit better. But on the other hand, if you ask people what they think of the targeting list, so we went around afterwards and we said, here's the list of people who came out of these methods. What do you think of the list? Are we missing anybody? Should we add anybody? You can see that they make many fewer the middle line is the community line. They make many fewer changes to the list if the list was drawn up during using the community method. So they say, well, on average, people say, well, in this neighborhood, you were missing, 1.5 people out of, I don't remember, 10 or 15 or something. But that's 33% lower in the community neighborhoods. How many people are on the list that actually don't deserve to be here? That's more than 50% lower in the community neighborhoods. We also put a little comment box in the village and said, what did you think of the way that the targeting was designed in this village? It's good, bad. If you have any comments, put in your, any complaints, put them in the complaint box. And we got about, 60% fewer complaints in the community method compared to the database method. And so what's going on here, I don't have time to go through the details of the slides, but what the answer, I think, is it's not that how do we reconcile these two facts? Why is it that the community did a little bit worse measured on kind of objective consumption, but everyone seemed happier with the community results? And the answer is that there are some slight differences between how these local communities think about what poverty means to them and what vulnerability means to them, and kind of just simple per capita consumption is measured in the data. And so if you ask, we actually also asked people in a survey before we started, tell me how you assess your own welfare. Imagine a ladder with 6 rungs on it from 1 to 6, where the richest or the best well-off are on rung 6 and the poorest are on rung 1. Where do you put yourself? I'm pretty well off, I say I'm a 5. Someone's pretty poor, they say they're a 1. If you look, the community method actually does a much better job picking out the village meetings in the community method, pick out and give the transfers to those who self-identified as poor. Okay, so yes, they were a little bit worse on matching kind of objective data, but they did a much better job on measuring people's own local conceptions of poverty. And so, for example, turns out that people, for example, who have a lot of children in the household, that gets a lot of children they have to support, that gets more weight. So if they have, for a given amount of income, but they have a lot of children, they have to send them to school, that kind of counts more for the community than if they had a same number of people in the same income, but kind of working age adults. Or widows, for example. They feel like, the widows maybe had lost kind of their main income earner, they have a more difficult time. They sort of compensate them for that in the local kind of social welfare metric. And we also look, there's no evidence of elite capture or anything like that. It doesn't really look like they're sort of putting the, village head's uncle on the list or anything like that. So I think what's really going on is there's a trade-off between what do you want to maximize. If you want to choose people who are kind of at the consumption-based level, the database approach works really well. If you want to use approaches to find this local welfare metric, that may work even better. Now, one important caveat, this may not work everywhere. This was in Indonesia. I think it's important to think about in your own contexts. Is this a good idea? Is it not a good idea? What's going to work better? What's going to work worse? But I think that there is this local information that can be really used to supplement proxy means tests. And another thing you could do is and I think there's important ways that they could be combined. So it may be that for a government program working at scale, you could use a data-based approach to try to find most of the people. But you could say, you know what, we're going to leave some extra slots. So maybe we'll fill 90% of the slots with the database approach, but let's leave 10% of the slots for the community to add people in case anyone was left out, and sort of address issues of exclusion error and address the gaps that were found using the data. I think that's an approach that could potentially work very well. And so how does that fit into COVID-19 policy? Well, one thing is, actually, in COVID-19, you might have thought those asset-based approaches would work particularly poorly because people received massive shocks. So their conditions and the kind of house they had and the assets they had, which were all kind of purchased before COVID, may not predict how they were doing during COVID. So actually, Indonesia in 2020 actually decided to use this community targeting-based approach at the national level. And basically, every village in Indonesia was allowed to use some of their village block grants to allocate cash transfers to households using a community-based targeting method. So over 8 million households in Indonesia received these transfers decided upon through this community method. So it's also a nice example of how this kind of research can kind of field into and can be used as evidence at scale, in policies at scale. And the final thing I want to say is that the one other challenge to this targeting question is that those assets are pretty fixed. They're not very dynamic. And so you need to think about, in addition to using community-based approaches where the communities can use local information, which they may know that some household received a shock, they can use that. There are other ways of getting kind of more accurate data. And so, for example, during COVID, many countries tried to expand their programs. They tried to sort of supplement the data in ways that were dynamic. So Togo, for example, used cell phone-based metadata to sort of figure out who's actually no longer using their phone as an indicator they don't have enough money to buy cell phone credits. That probably means they're poor. Pakistan sort of also similarly used cell phone metadata. There are new ways of sort of augmenting the database approach to make it more dynamic. And so I think that's another area that's worth thinking about moving forward. So to wrap up, I have a whole other set of things that I'm not going to talk about. Whoops. To wrap up, I think that the COVID crisis, we all saw there was a rapid expansion in the kinds of programs that needed to be targeted to poor households. And I wanted to convey to you a couple of different options as you're thinking about the programs that you may be implemented. How do you figure out those most vulnerable households? And to show both how you can answer that using kind of these randomized trials to figure out which works best, and to suggest that sort of the data-based methods and the community-based methods have different strengths and weaknesses that are worth thinking about as you design your own programs. So thank you very much. I'll stop there. I know my time is up. And I was also asked to invite you to the next session. So after this, there'll be a breakout room for in-depth discussion. There are going to be 3 breakout rooms. The first breakout room will have a discussion about children and youth with disabilities. So it'll be examples of applying inclusive education for people with disabilities. The second breakout room is migration, language, and ethnicity. So that's one going to be about best practices for applying inclusive education to issues of language and ethnicity. And the third breakout room will discuss in more depth the problem of the urban poor. They're going to be using the Mentimeter for collecting ideas. So you should all go to your breakout rooms next, but thank you very much for your attention. I really enjoyed talking to you all today.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Benjamin Oken. Wonderful speech. And all right, we will move to the breakout room together. All right, I would like to invite all of you and mention all of you, everyone. So we will go to our room for the room number 5 till 7. We are here together. And next, if you want to go to room number 1 till 4, we will go to outside and then we will turn left. And after this, if you want to go to the 11th room, so we will go to the opposite our room. So ladies and gentlemen, we are here together, and after this we will have another session, so please have a seat and go to your breakout room. Thank you very much. Just take a break.